Hello and welcome to what was originally going to be the second review of Request Month 2025, but obviously Request Month this year has not exactly gone well, so it's more like Request Season, I guess? I don't know. At any rate, this is Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, along with its expansion pack Alien Crossfire for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a turn-based 4X strategy game developed by Firaxis Games and published by Electronic Arts, first for PC in February of 1999, with the Mac and Linux versions coming out the following year. It also had the expansion pack, Alien Crossfire, which released later on in 1999, although the expansion pack is considerably less well remembered than the base game itself, which launched to absolutely massive amounts of acclaim, which really hasn't diminished much over the years. It is still looked upon very fondly by a lot of strategy game players out there, and its influence can still be felt in the 4X strategy genre to this day. The real question there, however, is how is it as a game in and of itself? If you go into this thing either coming from the Civilization series, or even just being a strategy game player in general, or even somebody who might be brand new to strategy games, is this something you should look into playing, or is it more of a historical curiosity at this point? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation. Now, remember that this game released in 1999, and even for 1999, it wasn't really all that much of a looker as far as strategy games go. That's not necessarily a huge problem, especially for a 4X turn-based strategy game, because the main thing you're going to be really concerned about in a strategy game is readability. You want to be able to look at a situation and quickly and easily grasp exactly what is going on. This is why it is much more important to have a clean, easy-to-read interface that gives you all of the information you need, and graphics that are not necessarily the most beautiful to look at, but are very clear and concise. You're able to just take a quick glance at something and tell exactly what it is, exactly what it does, and make a decision based on that. Not as much of a concern in a turn-based strategy game as it is a real-time strategy game, but it is still considerably more important than whether it simply looks good. That said, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri has a few problems in this regard. The first is that obviously the graphics have aged considerably over the years. This game wasn't really much of a looker in 1999, and obviously over 25 years later at this point, its visual fidelity really doesn't hold up anymore. You're dealing with very low-res sprites that even at the time looked a bit pixelated, and they look even more pixelated now. You're dealing with basically nothing in terms of actual in-game animations, and there's so little detail on most of the sprites that you can barely even tell what the units are half the time. The same is true when you look at the Alien Crossfire expansion, because it didn't do any substantial overhauls to the visuals. All it really did was add more stuff with the existing style, only it's arguably made worse by the introduction of alien units, which do look different from the human units, but they're even less detailed than the human units, so you can barely even tell what they're supposed to be. The strength of the game's visuals was always more in its stylings rather than the actual fidelity of it, and that goes for both the regular in-game graphics as well as the cutscenes, all of which are pre-rendered 3D animations, and they are extremely low resolution, and in very old video formats that really don't like running properly in modern systems. This is where I have to bring up Prax, because Prax is pretty much the only way I would ever recommend even considering giving this game a try anymore, and that is basically an open source modified renderer that allows the game to run properly on modern widescreen displays, although it still has issues, and I have to bring them up because they did severely impact the making of this video. Namely, every single time the game plays one of its pre-rendered cutscenes, it not only messes up the game's resolution and brings it back down to the tiny resolution that is the 640 by 480 video file, but when it goes back to the main game itself, it can mess up the window position, so you're no longer actually able to see it on the proper monitor. Now, this may not necessarily be as much of a problem for you if you don't run a multi-monitor setup. If you've got only one monitor, it may just display normally. but I have 2 monitors because I get plenty of use out of them, and so every single time it would play a cutscene, the window would move from my main monitor that I was recording over to my other monitor, which was not being recorded. And in order to get it back on the appropriate monitor to record it, I would have to minimize the window, drag it back over to the appropriate monitor, and then bring it back up to full screen before it would be effectively usable again. I found as well that as I kept doing this, it would continually break the resolution of the window. So, for example, if I would go into another cutscene a bit later on, then when it went back to the main game interface, suddenly the only part of it I could see was a tiny sliver of the interface. It was in a windowed mode, and I couldn't even see the actual interface to really be able to play the game at all. I had to do the Alt-Enter thing again, where it would go back to full screen or windowed, and do that until it came back to being properly full screen. And while obviously that is a mild annoyance if you're simply playing the game, if you're trying to record gameplay footage, it is very annoying. And if I wasn't recording the gameplay footage the way I happened to be recording it, then it would have broken the recording's resolutions and would have made the footage completely unusable. Now, obviously, your individual mileage is going to vary a lot with how much issues like that are going to affect you, but the point here is that Alpha Centauri doesn't really like modern systems all that much, and while Prax does make it easier to play on modern systems, it's still going to have issues even if you do use Prax. Now, the visuals and game engine showing their age are all one thing, and I think most people would be able to overcome those, but one thing that is considerably more difficult to overcome is the lack of readability when it comes to unit graphics. Now, of course, this does tie in with the visuals age, but it's also a matter of the actual visual stylings. You see, every single unit in Alpha Centauri is modular. This has some really interesting gameplay effects, but it also means that the units themselves are considerably more difficult to read at a glance. By that I mean, when you look at unit graphics, you can tell the general type it is, whether it's, say, a rover or an infantry unit or something along those lines, but to put it very simply, good luck figuring out what modules that unit has equipped. Moreover, this has a detrimental effect on the individuality of the various factions you can choose. Now, of course, this being a 4X game from the 90s, you can pretty much play each individual faction almost exactly the same as each other if you want to, but the idea is that each faction has its own specific style. So, for example, the UN Peacekeepers are meant to be geared more towards diplomacy and working together with the other factions, whereas Morgan Industries is all about commercialism, the Spartan Federation is all about militarism, the university is all about science and technology, and so on and so forth. And in practicality, you really can't tell the difference between the units of any individual faction. You can tell a bit of a difference in Alien Crossfire because the alien factions have their own specific unit graphics, whereas the human factions all continue to use the same unit graphics from the base game, but even then you still run into issues with the unit readability and the different alien factions looking exactly the same as one another. Thankfully, the unit readability problems don't extend to the interface itself. Generally speaking, the interface is pretty clean and easy to work with. There are a few things here and there that you'll just have to get used to, and you may have to consult the manual to initially understand, but once you understand what certain symbols mean, it's really not much of a problem. Now, the controls behind that interface, on the other hand, well, that's a bit of a different story, but we'll get there more when I talk about the gameplay. But as for the graphics and the interface itself, it's about as good as you could hope for in a 4X turn-based strategy game from the 90s. It's definitely an improvement over the previous 4X game that the team that made Alpha Centauri worked on, which was Civilization 2, but it's always had issues with the visuals just not really looking all that great to begin with, and unit readability being a problem, and the ensuing quarter of a century really hasn't helped the game out in that regard. It also hasn't really helped the sound design. Now, on the one hand, it does have one aspect that's actually quite good, which is the voice acting, and that's surprising because voice acting generally was pretty awful in the 90s, and here it's actually not too bad. The thing is that the voice acting in this really just consists of characters reading off entries in the various technologies that are researched, as well as reading off blurbs during cutscenes, and that does give the game quite a lot of personality. You see, as you look at these various blurbs and listen to the monologues from the various faction leaders, you really do get a strong indication of what those factions stand for, what their values are, what kind of modus operandi they have, and how they just see the world around them and how it influences the way that faction is supposed to be played, more or less. Now, of course, the reality of that is very different, and we'll get to that during the gameplay section, don't worry. But at the very least, the voiceovers definitely give the factions a lot more identity, and the game in general a lot more personality than it would have had without them. The rest of the sound design, on the other hand, is remarkably mediocre. The soundtrack, if you can even really call it that, consists of a rather unimpressive main theme that plays when you're at the main menu, as well as a bunch of ambient tracks that play during gameplay and are completely forgettable. They're just ambient sci-fi soundscapes that admittedly fit the game pretty decently, but you're not going to be listening to them outside of the confines of the game, and more likely than not, you're probably actually going to turn the music off so you can actually play your own soundtrack over the game instead. Then, of course, there's the sound effects themselves, which are completely unimpressive. They certainly get the job done. When you have units attacking each other, it sounds like sci-fi units attacking each other. When mind worms show up, you get weird sci-fi noises to denote the weird psionic things they're doing. And of course, there are various sound effects for when you're clicking around in the interface or moving units around. None of them are impressive at all. None of the combat sounds are particularly good. In fact, some of them can be rather annoying, especially if you're just speeding through a turn and you're having to cycle through a bunch of units and it just keeps playing the sound effects for them on top of each other. It just gets tiresome, to put it lightly. And when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that is very much a mixed bag. Even when it came out, it was very much a mixed bag as far as presentation goes, and it really hasn't aged well in the quarter century since its release. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although story in this is not really as important as gameplay, considering this is a strategy game. It does have quite a bit more to its story, and especially its lore, than, say, the Civilization games that preceded it, but story is always going to take a backseat in a game like this to simply playing through the game. Now, the idea is that in the future, humanity has taken off into the stars and has set off towards the star system Alpha Centauri in order to colonize it, which is of course how space race victories work in the Civilization series, so you can more or less assume that this is a sort of spiritual spin-off of the Civilization series, a sort of what-if scenario for what happens after the space race victory in a Civ game. You go off to Alpha Centauri, and what happens? Well, what happens is that during the journey, things go horribly awry, and communications with Earth are severed. The crew and colonists end up waking up earlier than they were supposed to, and get into squabbles amongst themselves, eventually forming 7 main factions amongst themselves, each of which has its own specific leader, and each of which represents different philosophies on how they should colonize this new world, and ultimately bring about the future of humanity. And from there, that is where the game actually begins. You start the game with your escape pod from the Unity spacecraft landing somewhere on the planet, which is simply named Planet, and wherever your escape pod lands is where your initial base is going to be. From there, it is a matter of the various human factions vying for control over Planet, and ultimately you are simply trying to lead your faction to victory over all of the other factions. Much the same as the Civilization series. As you continue playing through the game, you'll get various bits of lore that flesh out the various factions and their leaders, as well as the planet itself, because it's not just a big rock floating in space. Turns out, the planet is actually a massive organism that gradually gets more sentient as the game progresses, and humanity is going to have to find a way to adapt to that or face extinction. You also find out that it wasn't just this way to begin with. It was actually made this way by alien experimentation, and you get to see more related to the alien factions responsible for this in the Alien Crossfire expansion. It's all a pretty cool premise, but the actual story itself just doesn't really matter in any actual practical manner. It's nice flavor, but it's almost entirely irrelevant to what you'll actually be experiencing as you play through any given single-player game or even a multiplayer game, because you also get a story of some description in the multiplayer games as well. The way the factions are written, on the other hand, does actually have a more significant impact on the way you play through the game. They're not so massive of an impact that it's going to dramatically change the way you play any particular faction, but each faction does have its own starting technologies as well as its own specific bonuses that only that faction has. They also all have their own specific downsides. For example, the University of Planet faction gets bonuses to research, so they research technologies faster than all the other factions, and they get a network node building in every single one of their bases for free, which is a pretty powerful bonus. But on the downside, they're more vulnerable to probe units, which are this game's equivalent of spies, and they also suffer from having more drones than all of the other factions. I'll talk more about what drones are here in a moment, but the point here is that they have pretty hefty downsides while also having some pretty hefty bonuses, and all of the factions are like this. They all play a bit differently based on these bonuses and detriments they have, and the flavor between the various factions is portrayed very well. Through the various faction leaders reading off their blurbs whenever you discover technologies and you complete special projects, you really do get a great feel for how each of these factions views the world and their place in it. It really helps the factions feel a lot more grounded and gives the game a lot of personality. Of course, when you move over into the Alien Crossfire expansion, things get considerably messier because they do introduce additional factions, including 2 new alien factions, but none of them are quite as fleshed out as the factions were in the base game, because there's simply not as much content in the expansion that would help to expand upon these various factions. So while these factions all have their own mechanical differences that do make them play differently than the base game factions, they're simply not as well fleshed out and not as interesting as the base game factions are. And unfortunately, this also extends to the 2 alien factions introduced in the Alien Crossfire expansion. They're just not all that well fleshed out compared to the base game factions, and they're simply not as interesting from a story or lore standpoint, and even though they do have some pretty significant mechanical differences from the human factions, that unfortunately just doesn't balance out their personality issues all that much. And when you look at all that I've said about the way the story is written, the way that it is presented to the player, it becomes very obvious almost immediately that this game is really all about the gameplay. It is not really about the story and lore, even though that is certainly something that gives it quite a bit of character. So, what is the gameplay of Alpha Centauri like? Well, if you've played Civilization 2, it is going to be extremely familiar to you. This is because mechanically the game can be thought of as something of a Civilization 2.5. It does have some pretty noticeable differences from the Civilization series, like the way the terraforming system works, but in terms of general mechanics, it's going to be very comfortable and familiar to you if you've played 4X strategy games or especially the Civilization series. Each faction is ultimately trying to vie for control over planet, and you have a variety of victory conditions that you can go through to achieve this. The first is simple conquest. You just wipe out all of the opposing factions through military might. The second victory condition is diplomacy. You have to ultimately persuade all of the other factions to vote you as the supreme leader of planet, and in doing so, you secure a diplomatic victory. There are, however, a couple of twists on this. If you get elected supreme leader, then not all of the faction leaders may necessarily agree with the council's decision, and you'll end up having to conquer the dissenting factions. You also cannot win a diplomatic victory if either of the 2 alien factions are present in your game. They have to be eliminated before you can secure a diplomatic victory. There's also an economic victory, where if your economy is strong enough, then you can try to corner the global energy market, and the game then gives the other factions a period of time to try to conquer your headquarters, and if they fail to do so within the allotted time, then you secure economic victory. And then there are the 2 relatively unique victory conditions, those being Transcendence and Progenitor Victory. Progenitor Victory is only present in Alien Crossfire, so I'll cover that in a moment. But Transcendence Victory is basically the story victory condition for winning Alpha Centauri, where you have to complete some special projects, and if you do so, then you basically can evolve humanity beyond its current condition into a transcendent one. The progenitor victory, on the other hand, is only available in Alien Crossfire, and it is only available to the alien factions. And the idea there is that you have to build up your cities to the point where you can construct a subspace generator at least 6 of them, which will ultimately complete the resonance communicator. And when you complete the resonance communicator, it heralds the end of human civilization on the planet and secures victory for your faction. There are also some scenarios that you can play, and those might have their own specific victory conditions, so I'm not really going to talk much about those, but your mileage is going to vary depending on which scenario you're playing there. As for which of these victory conditions you're going to go for and how you're going to achieve it, it's going to largely depend on which faction you're playing. Some of them are more suited to certain victory conditions than others, and if you try to go for a victory condition that your faction isn't really all that suited for, it might be possible, but it's going to make the game a lot more difficult for you. But how does all of this actually work out in regular play? Well, regardless of which faction you're playing, you're going to be doing the same general things throughout every single turn. In order to achieve victory, you're going to have to do the 4 X's: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. You'll be sending your units around the map to explore it and find different places where it's good to expand by constructing new bases. You will be exploiting various resources that are going to be available to you, whether it be things like extra nutrient resources or extra minerals, as well as improving their output by constructing various terraforming projects on them. And of course, you will need to be exterminating your foes, whether that be the indigenous life forms like the mindworms, or the various enemy factions that you'll be coming up against and potentially coming into conflict with. And the particulars on how this all works are going to be very familiar to you if you've played Civilization 2 especially, but even Civilization 3 or 4, or really even Civ 5, 6, or 7, because the fundamentals are all pretty much the same there, it's the particulars that are going to change. Bases take the place of cities, and they will produce various resources. You have nutrients, which take the place of food, you have minerals, which take the place of production from the Civ series, and you have energy credits, which takes the place of wealth from the Civ series. Bases all have a population value, which represents the amount of citizens present, and as the base continues to grow and expand the number of citizens it has, more citizens can be placed on different tiles within the city's zone of influence in order to work those tiles and gain the benefits from them. So different tiles are going to have different amounts of these various resources available, and if you construct various terrain improvements on them, like, say, constructing mines on top of the mineral deposits, or constructing farms on top of nutrient deposits, or just constructing them on the various tiles to begin with, it's going to affect the amount of resources you're getting from those tiles. This is all obviously very familiar if you've played any of the Civ games. However, they do start throwing a bit of a monkey wrench into the works and giving Alpha Centauri its unique personality by throwing in things like xenofungus, which is something that takes over tiles, and until you've researched certain technologies that will actually allow you to get some use out of it, you end up having to remove it from tiles in order to be able to build improvements on them. There's also the distinction that when I say terraforming, and you're probably thinking of it being like with workers constructing improvements in Civ games, it actually goes beyond that. Not only can you construct improvements or plant or remove xenofungus, but you can actually change the elevation of the terrain if you want. And as your units are exploring the map, they'll occasionally come across Unity pods that will actually cause terraforming events to happen sometimes as well. So they'll cause a whole lot of tiles to just suddenly drop into the ocean, or just pop up into a bunch of mountains or things like that. And even though it doesn't always massively change the way you play the game or anything, it's still a really cool feature, and it's a real shame that the Civilization series didn't really catch on to it until quite a long time after this game, and the games that did implement some form of terrain deformation and such didn't really do a particularly great job of it. In addition to all of this terraforming and making sure your resource production is as high as you can get it, there's also the fact that you need to balance out resource production with the amount of units you have. If you have more units with higher maintenance costs than the resource production of your bases allow, then you actually have to disband units automatically because the bases can no longer support them. You also need to manage the moods of your citizens, because if your citizens become unhappy, then they will become what are referred to by this game as drones, and those not only negatively affect your base's production, they can actually outright shut down production by engaging in rioting. And you can try to curb these by constructing various improvements that will reduce the amount of drones you have, or, of course, committing the atrocity of nerve stapling them, which actually gets less effective the more you do it, and it actually instills penalties when you do it, not just on the drones that get nerve stapled, but also on the relations with other factions. If you commit atrocities like that, the other factions will absolutely hate you for it. And of course, nerve stapling is not the only atrocity you can commit. There's a whole host of them. Some of them you can commit on other factions, some of them you commit on your own citizens. Regardless, the other factions will absolutely hate you for using them. But anyway, regardless of how you manage your citizen moods, it is going to be a very important thing for managing your empire as a whole. You want to make sure that you can build up all of your bases so that you can maximize resource production and the number of units you can support, and minimize any problems with things like drones. So those are going to be very large chunks of how you're going to build out your, effectively, empire, where you're finding good locations for bases, you're sending your colony pods over to those to construct bases that you can then build up by constructing various facilities within those bases. You can, of course, create units to defend them as well. You're sending your former units around to perform various terraforming operations, whether it be simply constructing improvements or raising or lowering land or things like that. And of course, you're sending various military units around to explore the map, find out where the other factions are, find out where new base locations might be, and of course get into fights with the other factions, as well as the indigenous life roaming around that takes the place of barbarians that you would see in the Civ games. And in this particular case, it's almost exclusively mind worms, which are frankly really annoying to fight because they operate on psi combat rather than the regular combat that you see with most of the other units. And that basically means that their attack and defense stats are variable, and it can lead to very inconsistent outcomes in the combat. Plus, the sound effects they make when you get into combat are really annoying, so that doesn't help either. Aside from psi combat having the variable stats, however, combat is pretty straightforward in Alpha Centauri. It's much the same as the combat in Civ 1, 2, 3, and 4, where each unit has its own specific attack and defense stats, and theoretically, a unit with considerably higher attack stats than the enemy unit's defense stats is going to win that combat engagement. I say theoretically because combat in this game is like with the other Civilization games prior to Civ 5, where every single fight is basically just up to a roll of the dice. You may win it, you may not win it, you might have a unit with dramatically higher stats than the enemy unit you're fighting, and it will just lose, and lose bafflingly. And you'll sit there wondering what happened and how you could possibly have ended up with such a ridiculous scenario. And it encourages the use of what some people will call doom stacks, where you will just stack a whole bunch of units on top of each other and just continue to throw them at the enemy until eventually you just overwhelm them with sheer numbers. Alpha Centauri does introduce a pretty interesting mechanic to try to add some variety to the proceedings, though. And that is the unit customization system. You see, instead of getting new units like you would in Civilization games, like, say, going from musketmen to riflemen or something along those lines, in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, you unlock modules that you can then equip onto your various units. Each unit consists of its chassis, which is the general type of unit it is, whether it's infantry, rover, foil, which is a kind of boat, or something along those lines. And then, based on the different modules you apply to it, it's going to have different stats, and it's going to have different functionalities. And this even extends to the colony pods and the formers. They're not just specific units that you can create. They're built using this customization system, so if you want to, you can go in and customize your formers and your colony pods to have additional defenses, and maybe have better reactors and things like that. It's a really cool system that allows you to be very flexible with the way you craft your units. It does, however, have some pretty significant downsides. The first is that it introduces an awful lot of micromanagement if you really want to get the most out of it. And the second is that it creates a pretty significant readability problem, which is something that I mentioned during the presentation portion of this review, where it can get pretty difficult to tell exactly what a unit does at a glance, meaning that instead of just being able to quickly glance at a unit and say, oh, that's a rifleman, I know exactly what that does, I know what what I can counter it with. You instead have to look at the unit and look a lot more closely and say, okay, what kind of modules does this have equipped? How can I counter this? And with the sprite work being as undetailed as it is, that can very quickly become quite tedious. It's less of an issue when you're playing single player because the AI will stick to the templates that the game just gives you whenever you unlock new technologies. But even if you know that's going to be the case, sometimes it can still be a bit difficult to tell exactly what kind of units you're going up against, because the differences in the image can be very minimal between the different unit types. So you end up having to spend more time examining the units and figure out exactly what you're going up against, and again, that can just become quite tedious. But as for whether this unit customization system was ultimately worth implementing, it's hard to say one way or the other. On the one hand, it is a really cool feature, it is nice to have that flexibility, but on the other hand, it does have readability problems, it does make the game a bit more difficult to get into, especially if you don't like micromanaging your unit loadouts, and unfortunately, it just never really got refined. The Alien Crossfire expansion didn't really do too much to this system other than simply add extra modules for you to play around with, and the subsequent Civilization games went back to the older system of a specific unit having specific stats and just being able to quickly and easily tell what that unit is and what it does by glancing at it. So it's a mechanic that didn't really get refined in the 4X strategy context that Alpha Centauri sits in, and unfortunately with the way it's implemented in Alpha Centauri, it's rough enough that it can be considered more of a detriment than a positive, but it's also not so rough that you can't deal with it, especially if you're into that kind of granular customization. Unfortunately, this is one of those situations where I actually really wish that Alpha Centauri had a proper sequel instead of the incredibly weak spiritual successor that it did get, which was Civilization Beyond Earth. Because if they had taken that mechanic and actually really refined it with more modern graphics that do actually allow you to quickly and easily tell what modules a unit might have equipped, I can actually see that becoming a fully positive thing rather than just this really weird mixed bag that mostly comes down to personal preference. Because as it stands in Alpha Centauri, frankly, it's more of a gimmick than anything else. Sure, it's a nice thing to have, but does it really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things? No, especially if you're playing single player where you can just ignore it entirely and be perfectly fine. So that is a bit of a shame, but it also leads me into talking about more of the game's shortfalls. You see, generally speaking, the gameplay formula in Alpha Centauri is what you would see in Civilization 2, and to a slightly lesser extent, Civilization 3. I say that because Alpha Centauri is this very odd transitionary game between Civ 2 and Civ 3. Some of the ideas that Alpha Centauri plays around with would continue on into the Civilization games later on, starting of course with Civ 3, whereas others, like the extensive unit customization and the terraforming aspect, would ultimately be stuck in Alpha Centauri alone. And one of the features that they decided to play around with in Alpha Centauri is that by default, you cannot pick what your research topics are. The default rule set, the standard rules, have blind research, meaning that you can select the general categories of research you want to prioritize, so explore, build, etc., but you can't actually pick the specific technologies that you want to research, so whatever you end up researching ends up being fairly random. And while for demonstration purposes I went with the standard rule set for all the gameplay footage you're seeing here, frankly it's a downright stupid idea. You don't want to have that level of randomness in your technology research in a strategy game, especially a 4X strategy game. Now, of course, if you go with a more custom rule set, you can turn the blind research off, but then you also eliminate one of the things that makes the alien factions different from the human factions. Because you see, the two alien factions that they introduced in Alien Crossfire don't have blind research regardless of whether you're playing with that option enabled or disabled. Even if you are playing it with it enabled, they get to choose the topics they want to research. Meanwhile, if you disable the blind research option and everybody is able to do it, then that just reduces the uniqueness of the alien factions and makes it more obvious that they're really not very different from playing human factions apart from the extra victory condition they get. In fact, the Alien Crossfire expansion in general is just incredibly underwhelming. None of the new factions are really all that interesting, even the alien factions, weirdly enough, because as I mentioned during the writing section, they're just not all that well fleshed out compared to the base game factions. Because these factions don't have the breadth of content really fleshing them out and making them feel believable and interesting, they just end up being completely uninteresting and really just come across as more gameplay gimmicks than anything else. Especially considering that you can play as all of the base games factions in the Alien Crossfire expansion and take advantage of all of the new unit modules and technologies and such like that, but still have the factions actually being properly fleshed out. As a result, Alien Crossfire itself is completely forgettable. It's basically just a content pack, and you actually have to go out of your way to play it in the first place, even if you're opting for a digital copy of the game which includes this expansion, because by default, the shortcut that allows you to quickly and easily play the game is actually only for the base game. You have to go into the game files and create a shortcut for the expansion executable. Now granted, that is a bit of a technical limitation of games and expansion packs at the time this game originally released. It's not really a thing anymore because expansions and DLCs are actually treated as just content for the existing game, so it's still running off the original game's executable, just with this extra content added in. Back in the day, most expansion packs actually had their own executables, so if you wanted to play, for example, Alien Crossfire, you would install Alpha Centauri, then you would install Alien Crossfire on top of that, because it was still required to have the original game to be able to play it, and then to actually launch Alien Crossfire, you would go and select the Alien Crossfire executable instead of the original game's executable. Same kind of thing if you're playing something along the lines of, say, Age of Empires. If you had the Rise of Rome expansion, then you could install it on top of your Age of Empires installation, and then if you wanted to play the Rise of Rome content, you would have to put in the Rise of Rome disc and then select the Rise of Rome executable, and if you wanted to play the base game content, you'd have to put in the base games disc and select the original game's executable. Obviously these days things are a bit more convenient in that regard. You don't have a bunch of different executables you need to juggle, but in the case of an older game like Alpha Centauri, you still have to do that, and so I can't help but wonder how many people picked up Alpha Centauri from the digital copies, which have always included the Alien Crossfire expansion ever since it released on GOG, and yet never actually played the Alien Crossfire content just because the shortcut that was created from the installation only goes to the base game, and you can't actually access the Alien Crossfire content without launching the Alien Crossfire executable. The thing is, even if you do play Alien Crossfire, most of it is entirely forgettable compared to the base game. It's nice to have a few extra techs and a few extra modules to apply to your units, but mechanically it's all pretty much the same. Sure, the alien factions get that extra victory type, but other than that, you're still playing Alpha Centauri. It's not adding any massive new mechanics or anything like that. It's just more stuff for you to mess around with. That's fine, it's the kind of thing you would see from a lot of expansion packs back in the day, but at the same time, it should be pretty obvious to you why Alien Crossfire is more or less forgotten while the base game isn't. But of course, even the base game has its issues. I've already talked about how the combat can just kind of be a mess, how the unit customization system is a neat idea but just ends up being kind of a gimmick, how the blind research by default is just frankly stupid, and how poorly some of the game's presentational aspects have aged. But there's one aspect of the game that will probably throw a lot of people off almost immediately and will be an actual obstacle you would need to overcome if you actually want to play Alpha Centauri, and that is the game's controls and interface. It's not unusable. The interface is relatively clean. You can generally tell exactly what you need to tell just from quick glances at it, but some things are tucked away in certain menus that make them less accessible. The technology database is really not all that useful for determining what the actual tech tree is. Trying to complete certain actions, like say queuing up constructions at a base, is a bit clumsy and takes some getting used to. And the really big one is trying to move your units around is frankly kind of a pain. You see, the way you move units around is either by moving them up, down, left, or right with the arrow keys, or potentially even moving them diagonally if you have a numpad, which a lot of modern keyboards don't. Or you can click and drag on the map in order to create a green line going from where your unit is to wherever you're wanting it to move, and trying to get a decent path with that can be a bit clumsy. Or you can right-click on a particular tile and say move to this location, and the game will just find a path for the unit to travel on to try to get to that tile. But none of these options are truly all that intuitive. They're all a bit clumsy in their own ways, and it really makes it obvious that this is more of a transitionary game. It was going from games that were primarily keyboard-driven, so Civ 1 especially, but even Civ 2 was primarily a keyboard-driven game. It did have a mouse interface, but you were primarily just going to be memorizing the various key commands to get units to do what you wanted them to do, and to get production to do what you wanted it to do. Alpha Centauri is still very much in that same vein, so even though they have expanded the mouse interface to be more usable, and they have given you more options for moving units around and getting them to do things with the mouse, but it's still just not all that intuitive. In fact, it's kind of funny to look at Alpha Centauri versus Civilization 3, because you can look at Civilization 3 as a refinement of what came before in Civ 2, as well as Alpha Centauri, in this case effectively being Civ 2.5, and how they improve the interface pretty dramatically. It is considerably easier to pick up and play than Alpha Centauri, or especially Civ 2, or even more so Civ 1. And even once you do get used to the interface, there's all these odd mechanical quirks of older Civ-style gameplay that you're going to have to get used to, especially if you're coming into it from the more recent Civilization games like Civ 5, 6, and 7, where those games actively penalize you for having too many cities, whereas in older Civ games from Civ 4 and backwards, it was more incentivized to have a lot of cities, and when you got to Civ 1, it was even crazier about that. Alpha Centauri is where they started to try to get away from that by introducing more penalties for having too many cities at too much of a distance, or really bases at too much of a distance from your original capital base, or headquarters as it's called in this. And that mainly takes the form of penalties for overlapping base tiles, as well as inefficiency penalties the further the bases get away from your headquarters. And while it does more or less work for eliminating the just build ridiculous amounts of cities strategy, it's still an older Civ-style game, which means you're still going to have to expand dramatically and quickly. And by the end of the game, that can get pretty tedious to manage. This was also before they figured out how to really best display the information you need to play the game in the game itself. When you go into the sort of encyclopedia of all of the technologies, it's displaying them all alphabetically as opposed to in the tech tree like you would see in, say, the Civ games. Exact numerical bonuses and detriments aren't really explained to you in-game. There's not really any tooltips. It's simply not all that user-friendly, and if I didn't know how to play the Civ games from playing most of the other Civ games prior to going into Alpha Centauri, it would have absolutely been one hell of a learning curve. This is definitely one of those games where if you're not already familiar with how the mechanics work from having played the Civ games, you definitely need to read the manual, and frankly, you should be reading the manual anyway with any strategy game you pick up, if it even has one. These days, obviously, games don't really have manuals anymore. But Alpha Centauri comes from an era where you were expected to read the manual, and the digital releases of the game do include the manual in the game files. You kind of have to dig around to find it, but it is included in the game files, and if you get it on GOG, for example, you can actually download the manual separately into a place where you actually know where it is. The thing is, even if you do read the manual, you still will probably have to consult external information like the strategy wiki to really get a good grasp of all of the mechanics and really understand exactly what is going on under the hood. And for a lot of people, that might be a deal breaker. For strategy game fans, especially 4X strategy game fans, it probably isn't. but it is something to keep in mind. This game does have a learning curve, and the less familiar you are with the older Civilization mechanics from Civ 1 up through Civ 4, the steeper that learning curve is going to be. Which ultimately brings me to the central question with this review. Should you pick up and play Alpha Centauri? And unfortunately, my answer to that question is only a maybe. And it's a maybe for not only the reasons that I've already explained, but also for simply a personal one. This may come as a surprise to you considering that I enjoy the Civilization series, but I actually don't like Alpha Centauri. I don't especially dislike it either, but it just never really clicked for me like the Civilization games did, and I've never really been able to figure out why. I mean, after all, despite its shortcomings, Alpha Centauri is a high-quality game. It's basically Civilization 2.5, but set in space, and that should be right up my alley. But no matter how many times I've played it over the years, no matter how much time I've actually put into the game, I've just never really been able to enjoy it. I mean, there are some things that I do outright dislike about it, like the mind worms are just generally annoying, and of course the blind research mechanic is just downright stupid. But I'm used to older Civ mechanics. In fact, Civilization 3 is my favorite game in the series. And while obviously the interface isn't as intuitive, it's not so unintuitive that I wasn't able to adapt to it fairly quickly, so it doesn't really bother me, and the controls don't really bother me. So I've never really been able to pin down exactly why I don't like Alpha Centauri. It's something I should like, but I simply don't. And unfortunately, that does affect my ability to recommend for or against picking up this game, because in theory, I would recommend picking up this game if you're a fan of the Civilization series and you want something sci-fi, or of course if you're a 4X strategy game fan in general, or if you're looking at it from a more historical perspective, because Alpha Centauri was a very influential game. But in practice, I fit all of those categories. I like 4X games, I like the Civilization series, I like sci-fi, and I'm interested in the game from a historical perspective. And yet, for reasons I have yet to pin down, I simply don't like it. So I really can't say with certainty whether those groups will be able to find the game interesting and enjoyable. What I can say is that those groups should still probably give it a shot because it is interesting from a historical perspective. It is a high-quality 4X strategy game that fans of the genre and fans of the Civilization series will probably be able to get something out of. But you may just end up in the same boat that I'm in, where you play it and you fit all of the categories that would normally enjoy it, and for some baffling reason, you just don't enjoy it. But what I can say with certainty as far as recommendations go is that if you can't put up with older strategy game controls, if you can't put up with learning curves in strategy games, or you just don't like strategy games in general, or if you are very new to the 4X strategy game genre, Alpha Centauri is definitely not the game for you. If you are someone who's into 4X games but you're only just starting, play some of the newer ones that are easier to get into, and once you're more comfortable with those, maybe work your way back through the Civilization games, with Civ 3 in particular, before you try to tackle Alpha Centauri, because again, the learning curve gets steeper the further away you get from old school Civilization mechanics, and modern Civilization does play rather differently than old school Civ does. So just keep all of that in mind before you start trying to dive headfirst into this game. That said, even if you do give the game a try and don't really necessarily enjoy it, it's pretty cheap these days, and it's available on Steam and GOG, so I'll have links in the video description box where you can check it out if you're interested. And hopefully if you do check it out, you won't end up as bewildered as me when I try to mess around with it and sit there wondering constantly why I'm not enjoying it when I really should be. Thank you all very much for watching, and thank you all very much for bearing with me for how long it has taken this review to come out. Obviously, the intent was to get this done as the second review of Request Month for this year, and that has gone horribly awry. And I've just been running into monkey wrench after monkey wrench trying to get caught up on everything. So again, I really appreciate your patience on this. From here, I will of course continue with the original plan to cover Sniper Elite next, so stay tuned for that. I'll be trying to get some other content done in the meantime as well, stuff like DW Plays, and maybe some MTOs and stuff like that as well. So stay tuned for all of that. I'm hoping I can get caught up on things pretty quickly here, but we'll have to wait and see. And then from there, we'll just have to wait and see. There are some games that I'm working on in the pipeline here. I'm working on the Thief series. I've got that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle review that I was working on, and I'm hoping to get that finished up pretty soon. I'm going to change some plans regarding the Painkiller series, since 3D Realms just announced a new Painkiller game, and I'm thinking that I want to go ahead and cover those games a bit closer to when that game will actually be coming out, so I'm going to hold off on that just for now. But in the near future, we're going to get Indiana Jones: The Great Circle, the Thief series, and I will probably actually get my review of Avowed done before I get the Elex 2 review done. So keep an eye out for all of that. Hopefully it all goes much more smoothly than the past month and change have gone, but we'll just have to wait and see. Thank you all very much for watching. Thank you all very much for bearing with me during all of this. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.